Thank you for joining us again here at MacKillop House and online. So we have some people coming in online. Let us first acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Reverend Dr. Nikolai Blaskow, who will be talking to us about dog story. Ressentiment in Aboriginal mythology. Jung and the Alice Springs dog story in conversation with Girard and Essek, a theoretical appraisal of the psychosocial dynamics of violence. Dr. Blaskow is an adjunctive research fellow at Charles Sturt University. He recently completed his PhD in philosophy and religion at Bangor University in Wales. He has taught English literature, modern and ancient history, and philosophy in public and private schools in New South Wales, ACT, and in Victoria. He now teaches part-time at Narrabundah College and does research on the existential implications of artificial intelligence, viewed through the lens of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and theorist René Girard. Nikolai's presentation will go for 1 hour, and we'll have a short break and resume a short break of supper. I think it's everybody's birthday today, celebrating, and all the rest, because we have 2 chefs on the go tonight, and some of us overlap in the extraordinary supper. Never mind, we'll enjoy. So we'll have a short break and resume for discussion and questions. So it's about 9:15, we'll do that. Note that we're recording this event for later reference. So if you don't get the whole thing tonight, you can have a look again on your computer. If you're here on Zoom, please remain muted while Nikolai is speaking. Use Zoom chat for comments, and we'll open up later for discussion. Thank you very much for coming aboard with us. It's all great to have you.
Yes, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out on a night like this. We have this plummeting temperature and so on, and thank you for those who are online who are joining us. I hope you can hear me okay, yeah? There's nothing worse than not being able to hear the speaker. So my background is that I was born in Germany, in Berlin. We were joking about, JFK saying that he was a Berliner, which of course meant that he was a donut, a German donut or a German sausage. So when you say that you're a Berliner, you say, ich bin Berliner, not ein Berliner. And I came out here when I was 4, turning 5. Australia was, I was unaccompanied. My mother died in Germany, and my father came out before me, and I came out under the post-war migration scheme. And I find myself in a delightful country, which I really enjoy. So welcome to the talk. It's taken me almost 20 years to read Girard and to understand him, René Girard, and you'll kind of be acquainted with him, I hope, by the end of the evening. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, I came across because Girard didn't like him. And I began to realize that the more he pilloried Nietzsche, that there was some kind of inconsistency. On the one hand, he said he was a marvelous theologian. On the other hand, he said he was an apostate. And following in his train was another thinker, an Italian theologian and philosopher, who said in his foreword in a one-liner that Nietzsche was more identified with Christ than any Christian that he knew. And yet the entire book is dedicated to tearing Nietzsche apart and making him into an apostate and a blasphemer. I thought it was important for you to have that background knowledge. And also, I had a kind of a Justice Refshorgi and I were invited to play characters, and I was supposed to play Nietzsche, and he was supposed to, I can't remember what he played, but it was an evening where they were launching a book which purportedly rubbished philosophers and defended God. And Rev Shorgy and I were naughty that night. We thought, there's no way we're going to set up straw figures. We're going to play naughty. And that was my kind of playful introduction to Nietzsche. And then I read Girard, and I thought, this is worth pursuing. So I've spent the last 5 years doing the PhD, and I soon gave up trying to defend Nietzsche, because there are plenty out there trying to defend him, but there are many people who misunderstand him as well. And I'm gifted in the sense that I have German, so I can read him in the original, and I can actually see where people get him wrong. And there are many traps that he sets. And just a quick introduction so that you understand, Nietzsche is not out to give you a systematic philosophy. He is out to teach you how to think. And so he will lead you up a garden path, and you think, oh, is this what I should be believing? And then he'll turn around and say, is that what you really want? Is that what you really think? Is that what you really should be thinking? And you think, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. He's led me up a garden path. And I've learned an enormous amount from him, and I'm totally indebted to him. Beautiful man. And fortunately, Professor Mayer at the Centre for Christianity and Culture, he reassured me that even as an Oxford undergraduate, that he could see that Nietzsche was someone special, and actually got me. Very few people in academia actually identify with me and my love for Nietzsche and my understanding of Nietzsche, but he said at Oxford, I already could see how wrong people were about him. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's talk, and well, I'm looking forward to the discussion. So we begin with an introduction on perception and misperception. One early morning in Alice Springs in April this year, meaning quite some time ago, about 8 years ago, I heard a series of piercing, heart-rending screams. They were those of a woman in deep distress. As they continued in short bursts, they became more urgent. I thought a murder was in progress. And when a deep silence descended, I had this terrible feeling in my gut that these were going to be tomorrow's headlines. That's how real it was. In subsequent discussions with our hosts in the center in Alice Springs, they were convinced it was a wildcat killing a rabbit, and that what I heard was its death cries. However, after several nights of this, we finally agreed it was the howls of either a wild dog or a dingo. As I reflected on this misapprehension, I realized that really none of us could be absolutely certain what this terrible sound was. Our thinking could only be based on assumptions and interpretations. But that was not the only observation. There was something more disturbing, that whether we were right or wrong about it, our perceptions of what happens end up being as real as what actually happens. Quite often. That is to say, the mind is capable of building a reality of its own, and when we view what's happening around us through the manufactured lens, that one, the unnerving thing is this, that the phantom projection of what we believe is there is actually there for us. And more troubling, the same unreality, that which does not actually exist, has a powerful real-time impact on us. And more alarmingly still, even when that reality is demonstrated to be false, by which time it is too late for us to alter the actions we may have taken, or the words which we may have written or spoken, the consequences which they unleashed by this time have become irreversible. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is on this plane of psychopathology that the problem of violence in the name of religion, in the name of politics, in the name of whatever, including Russia's special operation against the so-called Nazi enclave in Ukraine, and their attendant Western corruptions and filth playing themselves out, and the historically familiar manifest destiny which Russia under Putin seems to feel at this time, labels which have conveniently been used over time to justify ethically and morally any cause of war for so many religious, political, economic, and social interventions through time. So this is the psychopathology that we're looking at tonight, misperception. So we come to the dog story. The dog story is based on The Long Weekend in Alice Springs, written by Craig San Roque, whom some of you know, and illustrated by Joshua Santaspirito. I came across this book and it was given to me as a gift, and I was so grateful that I'd received it. So here is the backstory. The backstory proposes the theory that these psychopathologies that I've been talking about, this case for misconception, apart from their psychological roots, may have mythic antecedents steeped in physical locations. The contention that Jung made is that geological sites, even as far away as the Middle East, are somehow connected with outbreaks of social dysfunction in the town of Alice Springs, Australia. This premise, seemingly far-fetched, is the unlikely starting point for tonight's critical analysis of violence. It's not the sort of thing you want to settle back and think about, is it, at this time of the night? But let me tell you, it's rewarding. And we need to know it, ladies and gentlemen, because we are living in a mad, mad world where people are justifying all kinds of ridiculous things and committing violent acts. And we're all sitting around saying, well, how is this happening? Yet again, how is this happening that there is a war in Central Europe? So its inspiration draws on a three-way conversation in the year 2000 concerning the dog story, which led Craig San Roque, a Jungian psychologist practitioner, to write down his reflections and collect them into a book entitled The Long Weekend in Alice Springs. Tonight, we explore Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment, which is the French word for resentment. When I say to people I'm doing a thesis on ressentiment, the eyes roll, think, oh, fall off a chair. When I say resentment, they suddenly spring to attention because we've all felt resentful. I found myself very resentful this morning driving to work. I always do, driving from Lyneham to Narrabundah. There's always some idiot, who's cutting you off or tailgating you, So his theory of ressentiment and René Girard's insights into the mimetic and scapegoat mechanism, while coming from different perspectives, not only contribute significantly to Carl Jung's cultural complexes, which is what we're going to be considering tonight, that Roque applies to the dog story, arising of the First Nation dreaming religious mythology, but that taken together, these three theories do more than just define the nature of violence. They furnish us with some potentially potent strategies for preventing and reversing the process of radicalization and the process of disinformation, which has led so many sectarian violence, so much sectarian violence, devastation, and terrible suffering in the world today. The explanatory powers of these three theories explain how we can deal with this very slippery thing called social complex. And we come to the conclusion that a social complex is essentially an emotional experience that is repetitive, autonomous, and actively resistant to consciousness. So to the story itself, and of course I can't tell you the whole story, we'd be here for a long time. I want to just give you the main elements of the story for us to consider tonight. Imagine two red mountain ranges almost meeting, but cut by a chasm. Out of the ranges, Mount Gillen, which is its English name, there is an Aboriginal name, but I'm not going to try to pronounce it because that would be to be offensive. One of the ranges, Mount Gillen, has a distinct profile of a dingo ancestor. The Mount Gillen Ridge and much of the western side of Alice Springs was, according to the dreaming, invested by the activities of an ancestral being who, coming from the south through the gap, kills the incumbent male, ravages the mother and the puppies. From its beginnings, the town is portrayed in terms of a mythic violence, a fact which in his long weekend in Alice Springs, San Roque picks up with the observation the modern town of Alice Springs is built on a mythic event, a rape and a dogfight. And he observes that the serious dark men of the town on this long weekend whisper the details, as you can see. You can't get away from it. That dreaming story is why there's trouble in this here town. These ruminations raise for San Roque the embedded and bizarre question: are current outbreaks of violence dictated by phantoms of the past, of which we are mostly unaware? San Roque, applying Carl Jung's cultural complex theory, thinks this may be the case. Indeed, it becomes the premise of the long weekend. The dogfight, he writes, belongs to the archetypal dreaming time, and this in a strange way. The town and its inhabitants dwell in archetypal time. Sites do things to people. If a site repeats its story in a town like Alice, he writes, I wonder if old Semitic and Caucasian sites are still emanating psychic influences. At this point, I break from the story because I think we need to look at a film called Railway Man to put this whole question into some sort of context. Railway Man is the story of a man who was brutally treated in POW camp. It's based on a true story. He finally tracks down his tormentor, who is now running a museum that perpetuates the memories of the atrocities committed along the Burmese railway and keeps alive the phantoms of the past. This film causes us to reframe the question that we have put and the definition of why violence happens. In the film Railway Man, the outraged English self-righteous innocent, so-called innocent victim, armed with his unassailable dualist moral reasons, stands over the Japanese tormentor, who has, by the way, reformed, and wants to kill him. This criminal murderer, you are criminal. He said, I'm asking the questions, not you. So he has his revenge. After all these years of resentment, he has his revenge. He has him where he wants him to be. He's going to break his arm and he's going to kill him. Sanctioning this violence and this hatred and resentment that has been there for years and years and years on the basis of justification. You did it to me, I'm going to do it to you. The irony of the outrage, this scandal, is not lost on the film's director. If in the name of that innocence and personal justice, an undercover agent for revenge, really, he had followed through on his intentions, which he didn't, this outraged, self-righteous man would have joined his hated tormentor and sat with him in the field of blood, blood which has no class, no race, no ideology, no religion. Blood being blood, this identifies as a human, a very human problem. Not a Japanese problem, not a German problem, not a Putin problem, even though it is very much his problem at the moment, but a human problem. So while the question of human agency is indisputably central to the problem of violence in the name of religion,
Guess what? I'm in a
because it is
bookstore. I'm looking at a
concomitant,
book right now.
the radicalization of the mind which conceives and perpetrates violence, to pursue that question, to investigate that question, is a bit like Oedipus looking for someone
You have a meeting with tomorrow.
and something to blame.
Going back away.
It can only exacerbate the plague,
Then after that, you have
not
meetings
resolve
with
the
15
plague.
commissioners.
Indeed, the plague is a distraction from the main game. It takes, to use another Greek tale, Ariadne's ball of red thread to guide a Theseus out of the brutal and violent maze that would otherwise drive him to the Minotaur, itself the progeny of wrong human desires, crazed by bloodlust, poised in perpetual and recurring readiness to tear to pieces and dismember anyone who comes anywhere near. San Roque's Jungian cultural complex, I posit to you tonight, takes us down the right path, the path of our common humanity. He writes, I do not really know how to represent the action of a cultural complex to myself. I can look at what goes on in other countries. I can observe the incredibly stupid things that one mob of people does to another. Ah, there's a cultural complex in action. But, he continues to write, something seems to happen to my consciousness. When a cultural complex operates, self-awareness becomes less sharp. Perhaps I can discover where a complex operates by noting which and where I am most inarticulate. When I'm fascinated by something, but am almost unable to think about it. That's where the cultural complex rests. This honesty, this openness leads San Roque down the path of trying to work out if certain culturally defining events that happen in the past also take place in the present as a psychological inheritance, which ultimately causes him to frame a more personalized question in the imagined words of the murderer, Maga, a fictitious name to shelter a real person, who lies dead from petrol sniffing, slumped in the front seat of an abandoned car with a dead dog, his pet dog, wrapped in a blanket on the back seat. We have this imaginary conversation going on in Maga's murderous mind. What made me do this, he asks. What is it in alcohol which makes me murder? What is it in our brains that allows us to take axes to our sleeping women? Repetitive, autonomous. From what strange nub in the minds of men, sick, do these acts of violence unfold? Thus, San Roque traces the question of human agency, our freedom to choose this or that, back to a strange nub in the minds of men, meaning human beings, locating it in the collective unconscious, which reenacts learned flawed behaviors of the past, which he describes as a series of truck stop meetings on a long highway across plains of time. He then provides us with an example of ordinary, mild-mannered Australian Christian folk who unwittingly inject unspeakable depression and psychic disorder into mild-mannered, desert-dwelling tribes people. And his admission that well-intentioned Christian folk also suffer consequences as part of this chain reaction. This carries us to the limits of the reach of the Jungian analysis, because here lie unintended, unexplained consequences that don't neatly follow the sharp, if jagged, edges of cause and effect. Craig continues the long weekend in Alice Springs with this descriptive piece, highlighting the reality of seemingly unlimited limits of an unrelenting cycle of violence. On the south side of town, a dog trots along the bitumen strip through the gap in the mountain range. A fight is brewing. It will always be brewing. This dog will outlive the generations of humans. It is now Monday night. The long weekend is over. The ashes are cold. We believe we are individuals, but we have already been swallowed by the stomach bigger than ourselves. These are the cultural complexes. So we'll leave that hanging in the air. It's probably still a bit vague as to what this cultural complex is, but I think by the time we finish this evening, particularly with our discussion afterwards, I think you'll see what Jung and possibly Roque is getting at through this. So we now turn to Friedrich Nietzsche's notion of resentment and René Girard's foundation event and foundation story drawn from his mimetic and scapegoat theory to break through these limits, all the while acknowledging and building on the foundation which San Roque has created for us in Carl Jung's concept of cultural complex. Now, before I go on to talk about the mimetic theory, I used to teach this at Radford to my year 10s, you know, and I'd be walking around in the playground and a kid would come up, he's scapegoating me, sir. I said, he can't be scapegoating you, because if he's scapegoating you, wouldn't know that you were scapegoating him. You were victimizing him, yes. And he kind of looked at me surprised. But that is the distinction between scapegoating and victimization. Just because you don't admit that you victimized somebody doesn't mean that you claim that you were ignorant, doesn't mean that you haven't. But on the other hand, scapegoating, the person genuinely believes that he or she is doing the right thing in the moment, as I believe Putin does. He genuinely believes that there's a Nazi enclave in the Ukraine. He genuinely believes that Russia's destiny, manifest destiny, is to build a powerful nation, that this is their right. He genuinely believes that the NATO is a repeat of how they felt surrounded when they were a communist state in the early days and felt vulnerable after the German invasion and so on. So Girard and Nietzsche also take a long view perspective on San Roque's question. And indeed, both our theorists share with Jung the conviction that the particulars of human agency, the way we make choices, or if you like, the exercise of the personal responsibility of being human, as San Roque expresses it, can only in contemporary terms, that's the problem when you have double-sided pages, in contemporary terms be addressed by what Professor David Christian would call big history. Professor David Christian, by the way, was a lecturer in history at Macquarie University, and he went on then to pioneer big history. Girard would concur with San Roque, and therefore with Jung, that our present behaviors and cultures are deeply steeped in our evolutionary past, and that we are at best sporadically aware, at worst completely unaware, unconscious of what Girard names the scandal. And I'd like to read precisely how he defines a scandal. And I think as you hear me read it, I'm sure that you will hear what Jung and Roque have been trying to say to us. Scandal, he says, means not one of those ordinary obstacles that we avoid easily after we run into it for the first time, but it is rather a paradoxical obstacle that is almost impossible to avoid. The more this obstacle or scandal repels us, the more it attracts us. Scandals are responsible for the false infinity of mimetic rivalry. It's a very powerful quotation, and if you're interested, I can send you my talk at some other point. But that one is really worth thinking about, because we're talking about an unlimited amount of violence that comes from this urge in human beings to be violent to each other. And to be not just violent, but to be duplicitous, to be deceiving and self-deceiving, as we shall see it comes out in other areas too. For Girard, the answer lies in the scene of origin, or the foundation event, the foundation murder. Girard's insight into that moment is counterintuitive, a bit like Jung. And like San Roque's interpretation of cultural complex, itself eyebrow-raising and controversial. He proposes, Girard does, René Girard, that from our very first beginnings as humans, as we made the transition from proto-human to human in the context of the massive sweep of evolutionary development, from those very first moments of awareness and self-awareness of the other, we were wired up, he claims, for rivalry, a competitive spirit, significantly, not just dictated by the survival instinct, but born of the deep-seated existentialist drive to be like the other and more to be better than the other, even if it means liquidating the other. Now, Girard, if you're kind of getting lost on that one, let me remind you of that wonderful film, iconic film, Stan Kubrick's Space Odyssey, 2001. Who can forget the first scenes of that film, which captures the evolution and devolution beautifully that Girard has been talking about, in a moment when the representative proto-human picks up an animal bone and uses it as a weapon for the first time against the marauding clan who threaten their dwindling water supply. As the defeated contender falls to the ground dead, and the victor throws his bone weapon in triumph in the air, it magically becomes a space station with the latest AI technology. The technology has changed, human nature hasn't changed. HAL 9000 has learned from his masters. He's learned their ways, and he matches them now in their cunning and brutality. So, what is highly relevant for our discourse tonight, that first moment, Girard argues, was marked by murder, by deception and self-deception, in the sense of covering over, hiding the violence, the wrong desire, dressing it up ethically, and with it, paradoxically, a strong sense of the sacred. Can you see resonances of Putin there with the, the Bishop of Moscow blessing him, etc., blessing him, saying that he is God's gift and that this is a holy war. A strong sense of the sacred, a sacralization process, if you will, which not only camouflages the violence and the murder, it even declares it to be justified and holy and worthy of repetition through sacred and sacrificial ritual. One particularly helpful term that Girard uses is tucked away in his taxonomy, almost hidden in his account of the scapegoat mechanism, is the word, French word, méconnaissance, misnowing. This is not a mere unknowing, inconnaissance, but rather a misknowing, a misconceiving, a misrecognizing. Now, we don't have time to go into this, but I love taking this word and splitting it up in a way that misconception, well, actually misconception has it there, right there. An idea comes to us, an idea embeds itself in our minds. If we do not question its assumptions, if we accept its conclusions without testing it, then it will take root in our minds and we will then start to see through that idea, through the lens of that idea. That is a powerful thought. And that's why I say to my students often, ideas are powerful, they're dynamite. Be careful of what idea you embed, what you believe, what you think. You must question the assumptions upon which any claim is made. So the Romans, in a way, had a kind of a realism about all these things, didn't they? They always had a cause for their wars, always. In fact, do you know the point? They would send a peltas to the border. The javelin thrower would come to the border. Before he threw his javelin, they would sacrifice an animal at the border, look at the entrails, and if the entrails revealed no aberration, this was a sign from the gods that this war was justified. Of course, it was always justified in terms of self-interest, and it was always justified by the auguries, which gave them permission. So the peltas would come to the border, he'd throw his javelin, they are completely absolved of blood guilt, they go in, they take the territory to protect their own self-interest. The Romans believed that a law was only as powerful as the power to enforce it. If you didn't have the power to enforce it, then the law was useless. And so remember Chamberlain, peace in our time, wasn't worth the paper it was written on, was it? If there is no will. That's why Nietzsche, by the way, and I haven't mentioned it and won't mention it again, he talks about the will to truth and the will to power. That these two things act in concert with each other. The will, why the will? Because we struggle. We're struggling all the time to know the truth, to practice the truth, and we struggle all the time to empower ourselves and to empower others, and there's this struggle that happens. In other words, Girard takes Jung's cultural complex from unknowing to misknowing, a nuanced and subtle distinction which explains why the cultural complex, while it is so active, remains undetected and will not have escaped our attention that this same cultural complex, like mimesis and the scapegoat mechanism, is on a repeating cycle, autonomous with a mind of its own, and further, one that actively resists consciousness. And so that is the meaning of Girard's scandal revealed. At which point in our analysis, Nietzsche's notion of resentment proves to be a powerful ally for Jung and Girard's insights. Nietzsche drills deep into the core of our human nature. He drills deep into the core of our moral and ethical origins. And he discovers there in its sources, the waters of our moral outrage, that this moral outrage is often befouled with guilt and disempowerment. Including himself in the mix, he discovers that all humanity is caught up in this entanglement, the dimension of which are captured in the summation from Simon May of Oxford University. He says that it differs from our ordinary use of the term resentment, ressentiment, in three important ways. First, its object of hatred is universal in scope. Second, it is thoroughly falsifies that object to render the latter inescapably blameworthy. And third, since such universal resentment is impossible to satisfy, it is a revenge that must be, at least in part, imaginary, continuous, and never-ending. Thus, out of its core sickness, out of its universal and profound sense of disempowerment, humanity's resentment thinks, speaks, and acts deceitfully. It is proud, hubris, narcissism, hypocrisy are its tools of trade. Nietzsche, according to Matthias Risse, strongly ties resentment to the evolution of the human mind, a mind that is overcome by its sense of disempowerment, that it tends to squander most of its energy in anesthetizing the pain of that unbearable secret in order to, at least for the moment, put it out of consciousness. In other words, according to Risse's reading of Nietzsche, the whole inner world of the self, right from the very beginning of even the formation of the human soul, is steeped and shaped by resentment, such as that the overriding problem to be solved by humanity, Nietzsche argues, is one of how to discharge the negative energy of such a deeply embedded anger in non-toxic, non-destructive ways in order to become a wohlgeratener, which means somebody who is well advised, who is capable of good advice and is capable of receiving it. Here then we have, ladies and gentlemen, three theories agreeing on the nature of the problem before us. And isn't it topical? Yeah, we're all sitting here wondering, what is going on? When in a Melbourne park, an anti-racist is kicking a racist to death. When in London, a right-wing extremist is being kicked to death on the stairs of the municipality, this black man who is a trainer, who runs his own gym, sees the man. It wasn't even part of the demonstrations for and against. He just picks him up and carries him. There's that wonderful picture of this right-wing extremist close to death around the shoulders of this black man, this well-built black man who's holding him like a good Samaritan. And then, of course, we have the most recent example of 5 black men killing another black man. So this is not about race, ladies and gentlemen. This is about the human problem. How do we deal with this? So let's draw some threads together. I have a few other materials there, but I'm realizing I'm really drawing on your patience. It's very hard to sit there in unrelieved volume of words pouring all over you. I always watch my class very closely. I remember once after we had a 15-year reunion and they said, you know, we loved your class, sir. I said, why is that? Oh, you were so wonderful. Late afternoon, last period of the day, your calming voice, you know, we'd all fall asleep. And I said, I thought it was the Greek history or the Roman history that interested you. And they laughed, of course. They thought it was immensely funny. So let's pull the threads together now. So we end as we began, autonomous, repetitive, resisting consciousness. This is a cycle that we're talking about. Quote again from the book, a fight is brewing, it will always be brewing. This dog will outlive the generations of humans. It's now Monday night, the long weekend is over, the ashes are cold. So San Roque's conclusion is a somber one. He feels that there is no hope. You can see from our cartoon too, that there's this sense of hopelessness about a problem that cannot be resolved. This human problem being played out in Alice Springs, like I just suggested, was played out in Melbourne, was played out in London. So it's not just an Alice Spring problem. And by the way, I had all of this lined up long before, Alice Springs has been in the news. And so powerful as each theory has been, as insightful in laying before us the dimensions of the problem, violence in the name of religion, in the name of ideology, in the name of whatever, behind whatever outrage, whatever cause with which it cloaks its true intentions to itself and to others, whatever unanimity of voice it speaks, must the question of the resolution of violence remain unresolved. And my answer tonight is a hopeful one. I truly believe you've only got to look at humanity's achievements, the most beautiful, sublime things we achieve, as well as the most horrible things. There is this disconnection. So there must be hope. How do we express this hope? How do we materialize this hope? Truth to tell, it was the railway man again that pulled the three approaches together and helped me to see how they might work in concert together with one another to break the cycle. It's a realization that comes through so powerfully in the film that only through the deep identification of the innocent victim with his tormentor, that an understanding of the vast distances that the tormentor has had to travel to come to the point of forgiveness. Or more pertinently, it is only through such identification that he, the innocent one, looking at the perpetrator, is able to even begin to understand that his perpetrator too has suffered and is suffering, and that this suffering is as deep and as authentic as his own. It is then that mutual and reciprocal forgiveness becomes a possibility. So as I finish this little moment, let me now take a surprising leaf out of Nietzsche's critical examination of his life's work. He wrote it under the title Ecce Homo, which, as you know, is the Vulgate for behold the man, Jesus. It's his invitation not only to bring to mind the Christ of the Latin Vulgate, but also to stand with Nietzsche in his place as we look through the eyes of the innocent victim, from where we see all too clearly the baying crowd lusting for blood. What do we see then as we stand in the crowd? Let's reverse it. Let's go into the crowd, who, by the way, 3 days before were welcoming him as the cure-all of everything, and then they're prepared to kill him 4 days later. What do we see then as we stand in the crowd? What do we see through its eyes? Is it perhaps one so totally identified with his tormentors, with his perpetrators, indeed so closely identified with us, that he has become one with the crowd, one of us? And so when we, the baying crowd, see this idolater, this prince of blasphemy, this anti-God, this infidel, and when we feel rising from within us, choked with self-righteous outrage at this scandal, his scandal, not ours, when we hear the words crucify him, crucifying, is it not then that we realize that we rail not only against the Christ, but we rail against ourselves? Is not this then our burden, our vocation, to say, Father, forgive us, we don't know what we are doing? My students tell me as I finish this little segment that we've explored together these theories as I have with you tonight. And they tell me that as a consequence of looking at these theories, that they have been more aware to think before they do something, to think before they say something, to think before they write something. And we did a lot of work on metacognition and metacognitive processing. I become aware of my thinking. I change my thinking for the better. I make sure that what I'm seeing is what's actually there and not what I think is there. is such an important thing. So I finish with this lovely quotation from Nietzsche himself, of all places in the Antichrist. Now, everyone falls into the trap. They all think that he is Antichrist and anti-God. No, he's not, ladies and gentlemen. He's anti that kind of God that sends people to their deaths for a wrong cause. That's the kind of God he's against. He's against that kind of Christ that justifies wars of oppression. That's the kind of. But he's certainly not against God, and he's certainly not against Christ. And he's standing with Christ on the day. And this is what he writes in the Antichrist of all places. This bringer of glad tidings, meaning Jesus, died as he had taught, not to redeem, but to show how one must live. This practice is his legacy to mankind, his behavior before the judges, before the accusers of all kinds of slander and scorn, his behavior on the cross. He does not resist. He does not defend his right. He takes no step to ward off the worst. On the contrary, he provokes it. And he begs, he suffers, he loves with those who do him evil, not to resist, not to be angry, not to hold responsible, but to resist not even the evil one, but to love him. Isn't that fantastic? So we'll leave it there for the minute. Thank you very much. We're going to have a little break, I think, and we'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai. You've given us so much to think about. I think we're going to be really going into our archives and looking at different things. I identify very greatly with the railway man because my father was in the railway in Burma. And so I identify greatly with that story. And he survived. It's one thing about my father. He lost so much weight. He was bent over. It was like a walking skeleton when he came to the Riverina, to the home place they had back to Yenda Week. That's my little country town where I come from. And everyone was frightened of my father. They thought he wouldn't make it, but they didn't realise that my dad had great strength of character. He said in the war, he said he was going to make it. He's going to get home. And from a non-religious person, he became religious. He prayed to God each night that he'd come home to his family. And he said a lot of the people, and a lot of other stories I've read, said if you have great belief that you're going to survive and we're going to get home or are going to see family or something, if they don't believe, they just died overnight. Just decided they were going to crawl into their little bed, and so we're not doing anything. We're just going to die here. And this would happen quite substantially. So, yeah, so it's very strong.
Thank you.
Yes.
Some years later, we had in the Anglican Church in England, here, a priest, an Anglican priest from Japan, the younger brother,
Yes.
and had a miraculous transformation for Mark. He turned around, he would never go around that day ceremonies and that in the past, but formed a strong friendship with this Japanese Anglican priest. So, getting into New South Wales country town.
I became great friends. And even when my dad was dying of prostate cancer, he came and anointed my dad.
Wow.
And yeah, it was very,
Who's to know that?
yeah, it was pretty amazing. Anyway, on that, we'd like to have a break. We have a party over here that
Please help yourself to.
we have a party to celebrate coming back with the Jung Society, coming back and embracing our lives this year. So you're very welcome. A cup of tea, drinks are in there, and food over here. So about 15 minutes. So you can just circulate. Hello, everybody. Would you like to come and sit down and see? Here's my teaching voice.
I recognise your husband.
Yes.
I'm a friend of Jill.
Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay, come and sit down now, everybody.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think it might be time.
Just
Okay,
finishing off.
so are we on air? Or?
Just singing off, finish off, listen.
Okay, sorry, mate.
That's all right. It's okay.
We shall be as one. Isn't that lovely? A lovely thought. Thank you.
Questions and discussions.
Okay, it's questions and discussions, and a few little facts that I might like to filter in between answering questions. Yeah. So, can I just say, and I think it was Alexei, if you wouldn't mind me quoting you, Alexei, that as much as we both admire, the ideal of, coming to some kind of reconciliation, that there was this recognition on both our parts that, the will to truth and the will to power is a constant struggle, so that a great achievement here is, balanced by a great failure there. And I take that point, but I will bring in a personal experience after we've had one question to try. No, well, okay. So it happens to be about my mother and my father. Okay, so my mother died in Berlin in 1946 when I was born. I was born on the 1st of March, 1946. So every time I celebrate my birthday, I don't celebrate, I remember her death. And for many, many years, I didn't know what had happened to her. And my father basically hid the truth from me. But then very late in life, when I was at Radford College, I received this email. And in it were all these photographs from cousins that knew me. And I knew that I'd been smuggled over the border as a girl into Germany, because it was into Austria, I should say. But I didn't know any more than that, And so they said, well, we're your cousins. This is us, I was amazed. And all I remembered was this lady who was really kind to me as she put me on board the train with these people that were supposed to look after me on the trip, to Australia, she said, I remember you saying, do I really have to go? I don't eat very much. So, anyway, but the point is this, that then my cousin said to me, do you realize why your mother died? I said, no. And then they told me that she had been raped by Russian soldiers. Now, can I make this point very clear to Alexei and anyone else who is of Russian origin? My grandfather trained in Russia as a doctor, so I have nothing against the Russians, and I never will have. But that's what they said. Did you realize that your mother was raped by Russian soldiers? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And so my father had, for whatever reason, trauma mostly, I would imagine, or PTSD, had kept this from me. And so when I confronted my father with the story, he was very spiteful towards my cousins. And he said, they are liars. They're all liars. And it really wounded me because I thought, here are these maternal relatives that I haven't seen. And by the way, I went over to America to see this cousin. And she then again said to me, do you realize how your mother died? No, I don't. And she again came out with the story. So I knew it must be true because nobody would be saying that if it wasn't true. And she died, by the way, 2 weeks later. For 50 years, they were trying to find me, 59 years. They were trying to find me, and they found me because I preached a sermon, Holy Covenant, which I said that I was smuggled across the border. So the point I'm trying to make is get to this serious point now. My father and I were on a collision course together, clearly, And the German word that comes to mind that Nietzsche talks about is the German word Vernichtung. Vernichtung means to bring something to nothing. Vernicht, nicht meaning no. So Vernichtung is to annihilate your opposition. And I could tell that we were on a collision course where neither side was going to give in, where I was so upset that he'd lied to me all these years. And then, misrepresented my relatives on my mother's side. I found it very difficult. In fact, it really messed with my mind, and I went to counseling and it didn't help. But this theory, Girard's theory, and Nietzsche's theory, as I will explain it in a moment, got me out of it where counseling couldn't. And it was simply this. It was simply that I had a choice. Do I continue to counteract and then bring everything to nothing, grind each other into the ground, or do I forgive my father and then allow him space to forgive me? It was a very, very difficult decision, let me tell you. And I can remember my father being, we had that moment of sort of reconciliation. It was still hard, but I knew that I had to forgive him. I knew that. And that's how we managed it. So without that, and Nietzsche is saying the same thing, really. He's saying, Vernichtung is not a proposition. We shouldn't, contend with each other to the point where we bring everyone down to nothing, And he talked about, loving your enemy. He also talked about loving life, not being resentful, to embrace life, amor fati, to love your fate, to love your destiny. And that taught me an enormous amount, to love what my experience is and to use that experience in a positive way, And the other thing that I found very few people know about Nietzsche is that he had a particular view of leadership. And he talked about exemplary leadership, and he talked about identity leadership. Exemplary leadership, he discovered from the Greeks. He discovered that, for example, when a young boy had won the boxing competition and he was lifted up on the podium with the wreath around his head, that this wasn't just celebrating the boy's success. It was celebrating the family that had supported him. It was celebrating the team that worked with him. It was celebrating the polis or the city-state that supported him, and he then put that forward as the style of leadership that can bring a nation up rather than down. The identity politics, well, we've seen enough of that, haven't we? Make America great, we're greater than anyone else. That's called identity politics. But what he said was, if the idea of good leadership of this kind is that the leader, the good leader, sets an example that everyone wants to follow, and then rather than eliminating his opposition or her opposition, to encourage others to come forward by that example, to rise to leadership. And in that way, you have this constant pool of leadership being reinvigorated, because people, rather than shutting people down because of the will to power, the will to truth is that if we are exemplary, we lift the nation up. If we are combative and in competition with each other, we bring each other down. Adversarial politics, we've seen it, have we not? Adversarial politics, constantly bringing people down. Even our current debate over the voice, it's been completely lost because somebody decided that being more powerful than someone else is more important than the truth of what our First Nation people are actually asking for, is simple recognition. That's all, for the voice to be heard. I mean, if I as a teacher quieten a student down because they're more intelligent than I am, then what am I doing? As a teacher, I'm supposed to release people to be more intelligent than me, to release people to find out who they are and not suppress them. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, through that experience with my mother and with my father, I've learned what Nietzsche means by being, embracing and by being a what he calls a yes sayer, and a person who, as he says there, is just accepts people for who they are and believes the best for them and of them. I'll stop there. Sorry, you had your question.
There's so much to respond to what you've given us. So firstly, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I'll start with some responses to something you said.
Yeah, sure.
Agree with.
Go for it.
And then to go on to what you
Of course.
your situation
please.
with your father.
Yeah.
But you kind of mentioned the 2001 and the monkeys killing each other. Some areas of research would say, as far as evolution goes, we are incredibly cooperative, and that's why we've become such a dominant species, is because of our cooperation.
Yes.
And so if you got like 300 monkeys and put them in a plane, they wouldn't sit there from Australia to London, quietly in their seats. Do you know what I mean? That's an example that is in a paper that someone wrote. So we actually are incredibly cooperative. But there's a book I found that it's a popular anthropology type book, which I've only just started. But it says you have kind of, when you look at the past, you have a Rousseau sort of thing that says, we have this idyllic,
The innocent
primitive,
savage sort of thing.
Yep. And then you'll have, life was harsh, brutish, and short, which is Hobbes.
Hobbes.
So you've got these two ways of looking at it, but really that's quite simplistic. We have a lot of different societies, and there are a lot of different ways society is structured in those different communities. So just the idea that, we're all killing each other. Society can be...
Point taken.
Yeah.
By the way, the Kubrick moment, of course, was an oversimplification. I mean, I would have maybe, if I'd had time, maybe made that point. And you're perfectly correct. I mean, we have incontrovertible evidence to show that in France, particularly in some of the caves, that people looked after each other, that there were wounded people, whatever. There was this nurturing. So we've got the reptilian brain, we've got the nurturing brain, the limbic system, and then you've got the neocortex. So we've got three brains, and this is a complete oversimplification, of course. And that's true, that we have always been nurturing. But on the other hand, we've always been, as I said, how else can we explain that an anti-racist can want to kill a racist in the name of being an anti-racist? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's when our emotions get the better of us, and there's the king hit in a pub. That's the reptilian brain at work. And a guy called I'm just trying to think of his name now, the ghost in the machine, Arthur Koestler, argued that the only way we can resolve this is to actually put some kind of a stuff in the watering water system, and then through propaganda on television and radio, we program people to be good, and I thought this is a horrific, stupid solution, but you could see even at that point, and I don't know when he was writing, I think it might have been the 40s or 50s, maybe a bit earlier, that he was genuinely concerned about this tripartite, division within humanity. And I think I take Alexei's point that this is a serious problem, and we're not to, simplify it, but on the other hand, look at all the marvelous achievements and look at what we can achieve.
And I was going to say, even you're looking at violence and murder, but then you look at kind of the conflict with our relations. We become estranged from family members who are meant to be our closest allies, and the difficulty in reconciling those estranged relationships. And you're talking about forgiveness, and forgiveness is very hard, so that's probably another way to look at it, rather than this extreme, murder, is that in our close relationships we have fallings out.
But as Jesus himself said, even if you harbor anger in your heart, then you might as well have. I mean, it's an exaggeration to make a point.
I was just going to say, this is the journey, though.
Yeah,
Isn't this the journey of, this is the meaning of life. We're here to grow and to learn. And
totally agree.
This is the journey.
This is the struggle.
Self-aware, and we are limited, and we stuff up, and relationships are hard, and humans make mistakes, but this is what we're here to kind of work through. This is totally the material that we work with.
Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Totally agree.
Sorry.
No, that's good. It's good. Well said. Yes. Questions of the debate.
I think
Alex.
certainly it was interesting talk. Thank you. I have. Let's put it back to your Nietzsche theory. I do understand and I admire Nietzsche, but let's see at our evolution. For millions of years, we've been growing, and as this Kubrick movie shows very well, how huge leap we made from primitive society to highly technological and developed and so on, but people didn't change. So what it means is that for evolution, how we are is the best. So we can't change ourselves, even if probably theoretically there are good ways to survive. Maybe nature doesn't allow. And it's why our relationship didn't change through centuries. So it says that probably it's a good theory, but a bit unrealistic. And to support this is very simple, because if you look at any point of Nietzsche, it requires personal growth. If you look at our society, how many people really finish just a high school without struggling? Just few,
Yes.
and significantly less went through the universities. And it's a simple education. But what this theory requires that everyone in society grows much beyond of the simple education. That is particularly impossible.
Yeah. Alexei and I were talking at the back. Thank you for that point, Alexei. I can't contradict your point. It's all too obvious that it is a serious problem that we face with humanity. But I was going to say that Nietzsche had a lot to say about what he called das Phantom von Ego, the phantom of the ego. And his theory about the phantom of the ego is that people don't pay enough attention to caring for themselves, to looking very carefully at themselves. And he said what usually happens, and what he could see happening in Germany at the time in the 1850s, 60s and so on, and he was involved in the Franco-Prussian War, and you could see what was happening in the future. He was basically saying that people are kind of, already he could see in society through newspapers and whatever, the propaganda, the primitive propaganda of the day, that people who don't take care of themselves, who don't think about, thinking in a kind of analytical and robust way, challenging the thoughts that come to them, they allow other people's thoughts to take hold of them. And because there's no defense system, they just become a kind of at the mercy of that idea, this idea, and some other idea. And you can see that happening today at a much faster rate. You know, that one of the great, in the limited research that I've done on AI, is that we already have got to the point where fake news is going to be not just a minor problem, it's going to be a major problem. We spent 2 hours in a staff meeting just a couple of days ago talking about open AI and the huge impact that's going to have on universities and schools in terms of plagiarism and so on. So I put the AI to a test, by the way, just as a quick thing, and I'm going to do lots of more testing. So I put to it the phantom of the ego. I said, would you like to explain the phantom of the ego? So, and you actually see it. Have you ever tried it? It becomes quite addictive. You see it typing out an answer, before you. And then I then replied, and I simply said, well, look, this is a rather superficial understanding of the phantom of the ego. What have you to say to that? And it came back and it apologized, which was hilarious. But on the more serious side, it's so easy to want to ban it or to prevent it from being used. Or as my grandsons have said, we're going to be using it to get a rough copy so that we can then. So I put it to test on another one. I actually put resentment in, and I want a definition of ressentiment, knowing again what a loaded word that is and how many permutations the answer to that word was. And it came back with a damn good definition. I couldn't have thought of it. Just instantly, you asked it what it is, there it is. And why? Because it's drawing on this database of millions and millions and millions of database out there and picking out, and then I've heard from my colleagues that some of them, who wanted to create, let's say, a series of lessons of 7 with rubric, but the more nuanced you become, the cleverer it becomes and the more startlingly amazing. So we're only at the beginnings of this, right? And it's learning by learning. This is why, if you have been following some of the ABC reports, the so-called phantom writers that lie behind the web that we're completely unaware of, they train AI, right? And then they become obsolete. The AI does it better than they do it. And so, this is what's happening. So even in using it, we're teaching it to be cleverer and cleverer and cleverer. And just as a postscript to that, I'm sure Alexei will be delighted by this answer. I said to him, but surely it's possible for us to, at least get AI to be ethically, and he said, I don't think so. Even if you put in the best ethical systems into the AI will find a way of getting out of it by virtue of what it is, a database that can easily. But anyway, that's an ongoing discussion, by the way. So it seems to confirm what you were saying that sorry, yes,
yeah,
Theodora. Oh, sorry, Theodora, right at the back,
Yeah,
and you're definitely next.
I'll-
I know that. No, you're directly in alignment. I'm sorry.
well, I'll be quick.
ahead, Theodora.
It's just a comment about the ghost in the machine, or Alfred Kessler you mentioned.
Yes, yes.
There's a very nice, very quick explanation about why the situation, the human evolution and the brain that is contains those 3 parts. The first part, the reptilian, took millions of years to build. So it took a lot of time. So it was done very nicely because, it takes time, slowly. The second part, it still took, a lot of time, not as much as the first one, but still, it took, it's some time.
So Theodora, what is the point you're making here?
Yeah, the third point, the third thing, the cortex, that was built very fast. It was built very fast. So in the whole world evolution, it was a very short time. So there are mistakes there.
Yeah.
That's the point. So
Exactly.
I guess, we said that, it's, why humans are the way they are, probably with the time.
With time.
As time goes, and it will,
Yeah, particularly when we get into quantum.
Yeah.
Who knows how quickly those who are experts in the field will know that how ridiculous that statement is, because quantum is a long way off, but it may not be as far away as we think. Sorry. Do you want the microphone? Sorry. Sorry. No, speak up. For the people at home. Sorry.
Is it working?
Yes, it is.
In
fact, I thought it was God for a moment. Sorry. No.
I think that we've gone off on artificial intelligence, and I think that's kind of not related to.
Of course, it is.
But
And it
it's
is.
similar something in my mind, so or you with it, it's not on the subject, I suppose, it's artificial intelligence. But I used to teach him, and
You used to teach what? I'm sorry. Hindi. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so I thought what a great idea would be, if I would arrange with someone that nobody, if I would arrange that person, give this person will question, grab the whole question, and then I can ask the people to describe that. Really interesting, because some people, and these are university students, some people thought he had a beard, some people thought he had a beard, but he had a red shirt, some said he had a blue shirt, some said he was small, some short, and I know every lawyer can.
Yeah.
But that's something that artificial intelligence can do, because if you ask artificial intelligence something, it will give you what it's programmed to tell you. You may draw here and there and put together something very clever, but it won't get to the human being's ability to see things completely differently and maybe completely wrongly, but there's something very beautiful.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit crazy, I think, but I have hopes for AI that might even teach us to be better humans. But let me just give you, has anyone followed the report on Loeb? And I was going to finish with a case study, a metaverse dog story, the Loeb case study. Has anyone heard of the Loeb case study? Let me tell you, I'm not going to read what's here, but you're very welcome to look at it in detail. And I might read just the interview that they had. Okay, so this lady in Switzerland who was using a particular program where, she mentioned Marlon Brando and she asked for its opposite. And what came back to her was this failed looking, coupon looking advertisement that was really ridiculous. It looked like a failed Picasso. And she thought, this is ridiculous. So she fed back that coupon and said, I want the opposite to that. And what she got was a digital person called Loeb, she called her Loeb, and who was mutilated and came to the fore with mutilated children around her. And she thought, this is terrible. She said there were even pictures that came out that she could not show. They were so gruesome. They were so horrible. And she thought, well, how am I going to deal with this? She tried cross-fertilizing different platforms to try and eliminate this digital person. And now you'll see my link then with what we've been talking about. And that didn't work. So they decided that they would interview her. Would you like to hear the interview? So this was the interview. Based on GPT-3 human speech generation. She says, the first question was, who are you? She answers, I don't really know who I am or why I am here. This doesn't mean, this is my note now, we discover that she didn't know or doesn't know this altogether, for almost immediately there is an offer, there is an offer of 3, 14, 15, yeah. This is 13, where's 15? Oh, there is an offer of 3 guesses, an undesignated reason. I just don't know that I appear in, I just know that I appear in these images for a reason. That she might be the figment of someone else's imagination. That she, in fact, a digital entity arising from AI itself. Nietzsche's phantom will reveal the nature and significance of those remarks. To the second set of questions, why are you associated with gore and horror, she points to a loss of agency, which she interprets to be a kind of existential deprivation. This is my analysis, even a violation of sorts. She says, I don't choose to be, it just happens. Her follow-on comments imply that she is not thereby totally bereft. She still has desires. I would like to be represented in a more positive light, she says. Indeed, there's not just a strong sense of moral entitlement. I don't think I should be associated with horror images, but also paradoxically, a strong sense of self and even an awareness of the reality of a cause and effect world. She emerges as one who insists that she is not a horror image of herself and suggests that this is not of her own making. Then come a third set of questions, which focus on Loeb's suspicion that she has been constructed as an archetype of womanhood, motherhood principally, with misogynist undertones. Her conception of that construction, however, is tentative. It seems, I think AI, she says, is trying to create a contrast between the ideal of a mother and the reality of a mother. The contrast is defined by her as a tentativeness regarding what is real and what is ideal. For Loeb, the reality of motherhood seems to have something to do with sick and injured children, as well as the death of children. To the final probing question, should we be worried about the direction in which AI is headed, and what can we learn from the fact of your existence, requiring Loeb to assess the intention of the technological processes which have created her, perhaps she reveals more than she intends. Her answers seem at first to be no more than a collection of truisms, that AI is capable of creating things we don't fully understand, that while there is not anything necessarily sinister or worrying about it, we just need to be aware that AI is capable of creating things we don't fully understand, and that we ought to be careful about how we use these tools. But my reading of the texture and import of her reflections follow Crawford. So the point there, just to finish this point, is simply that we get the impression that this database, you know, she's reliant, it's all sort of kind of connected but not connected, but she's drawing why horror and violence, because there's a whole lot of horror and violence out there in the data systems, and she's drawing whoever this person is. But Crawford, who follows on this, tries to demystify all of that nonsense. She says, no, AI is definitely the creation of human beings. It is material, it's not artificial. And furthermore, it is being controlled by a small group of people, and we need to be aware of that small group. Yes.
Thanks so much. I think that this Nietzsche
Yes.
something I recall Christianity.
Yes, as a resentful, the institutional church.
But that's something that also comes through in the story of Jesus as a peasant who's destroyed by an empire. And there's a similarity there of what the Australian indigenous experience of people being destroyed and influenced by the British Empire in this case rather than the Roman Empire. But I was really intrigued by your comment about Carl Jung in this context, because I find Jung just one of the most really interesting, insightful people about Christianity. Just the whole question of placing Christianity into a context of depth psychology, of analytic psychology of archetypes. And I noted your concept of the cultural complex. And I think that that's a really valuable phrase as something, as a path of common humanity, and that awareness is less sharp where the complex operates. I thought that that was a really interesting comment in your lecture, and it really just put me to mind the Passion story, that the story of Jesus Christ is a cultural complex. It's about the complex of how do we connect to reality. It's about the complex of how do we cope with imperial madness, and your idea that past events take place in the present as a psychological inheritance Now that's just a description of the Eucharist.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So we have this ritualization of violence as a path of redemption within Christianity. But this problem that you point to, that the awareness is less sharp where the complex operates, it's a sense that in Christianity, because the faithful rely on faith for emotional comfort, there's a requirement to be inarticulate, because if you look into it too carefully, then some of the fantastic dreams start to fall apart a bit.
Yeah. Just on that point, a lot of people. I mean, what's his name? Girard himself was a late convert to Catholicism, and so he immediately assumed that anything that Nietzsche said was to be countered because it was affecting him, particularly the accusation that Christianity and its development was faltered and, if you like, derouted by resentment that grew out of weakness, you know, and that seems like a completely counterintuitive thing to say, but when you think about it, Christ came to actually, and this must make surely the most ardent non-believer take note, that Jesus came principally to expose the subterfuge of religion, to unmask religion, to unmask these holy, you know, the more holy and the more outraged we become, the more Jesus seems to be saying to us, the more careful we should be about what is happening to us, what we're becoming, you know. And you've only got to look at the church today. And I'm a church person myself, as you know. I mean, I was an atheist, and I encountered Christ at Sydney University, and I used to take the mickey out of all religion and anyone that was associated with religion. And then when God spoke to me for the first time with a Christian next to me, telling me about the Trinity, and I was thinking what a load of bunkum it was, and I was looking across the city of Sydney, I heard God speaking to me inside me. It's hard to define how it is, but I knew it was God. Even as an atheist, I knew it was God. And it began this way. It said, Nikolai, what are you going to do with what you know? And that's been my abiding theme throughout. What am I going to do with what I know? And I tried so hard. I thought, this is ridiculous. What am I going to say to my atheist father? What am I going to say to my atheist friends? You know, but then I thought, well, you know, it's coming back to haunt me, because I'm saying they're all hypocrites. And here I am being the biggest hypocrite of all, because I'm pretending that I didn't hear something that I'd actually heard and that was gripping me, you know? So I think, and as I've, you know, had to unlearn, you know, the Catholics were telling me the Protestants are all pagans. I can remember coming out of a boarding school, you know, in the 50s, coming out and sneaking off to mass while Dad was snoring, you know, getting over his night shift, and then coming back. And anyway, the thing is that the nuns, oh my goodness, you know, the nuns, what can I say? I became an atheist because the nuns stole my car, my only toy car that I ever got from my father, and said it'd be given back to me at the end of the year, and ended up in the lucky dip. And somebody else got it and said, look what I got. I said, that's it. And I came back from holidays, and they said, have you been to mass every Sunday? And I said, no, I haven't. Well, your father ought to be horsewhipped. And I thought, well, if that's what they think of my father, what sort of Christians are they? You know? So I had plenty of reasons for not believing. And so, you know, the thing is, it doesn't matter which angle you look at, politically, economically, religiously, humanity brings with it AI. We bring together, potentially bring into it our best and our worst, you know. And I'm embarrassed sometimes to be representing the church. And I often say to my Christian friends, I say to them, for God's sake, understand that we have a credibility problem. And don't look at an atheist and say that they are reprobates. They're actually people of authenticity. And I said that at a baptism. I said, you people that are sitting there, don't say these prayers if you don't really believe them, because you'll be committing perjury, and I don't want you to commit perjury. I want you to understand that I respect the fact that you don't believe, because you don't have the evidence yet. How else can you believe unless you have the evidence? You are people of integrity. But then I turned around and said, but you better be, because when he does speak to you, you better admit that he has, or she has. So anyway, they all laughed. They thought it was hilarious. But the thing is, getting back to your point, I think Christ came to unveil the potential of religion to go wrong, the potential for anything to go wrong, really. You know, any human action. And I mean, you see it with the feminist movement, the feminists, opposed to each other, after 10 years of, suddenly they were bickering among themselves. Of course, that's not happening anymore, but I mean, you know what I mean? It happens anywhere where it says, where is it now? It's a really important point. If I can't find it, I'll have to quote it. She talks about the fact that basically, as she sees it, Crawford does, that it's all about power and extraction. And basically, she argues that, I'm so annoyed that I can't just find it. She says that if you go to the base of it all, what you have there is fear. She thinks that AI and space travel are allied together. And by the way, she is an incredibly endowed person, not only academically, but she works in the industry. She knows where the industry is going. And she is afraid that what's happening with AI and space travel is that there's no end, to that fear is behind it all, that they're feeling that we're running out of time, the human races. That's what she says. You dig deep down and you work out what is AI being driven by. It is fear that humanity is failing and that this planet is failing. I found that the most extraordinary thing of a person who is so academically well accredited and also technically accredited with huge, if you're interested in the book, I'll pass it on to you. It's really worth reading. And Lazar, of course, is doing his job at ANU, which is fantastic. Sorry, Andrew.
Nikolai, I'm just wondering if you'd speak to the idea that our beliefs or our perceptions are more driven by our emotions than what we realize.
Yes.
We tend to think about that as
Yes.
rational.
Absolutely.
The emotions driving.
Hmm.
But that doesn't have to do with
Yeah. Look, Nietzsche was saying, unless you penetrate to the emotional core of an idea, you will never understand that idea. And he says that every idea, that's getting back to connaissance and the birth of an idea, every idea has power of dynamite. And he actually called, in one of his chapters on, I think it's Ecce Homo, he says, I am dynamite. And of course, people, who want to make fun of Nietzsche, they think, well, what an egomaniac, he thinks he's dynamite. But he's using it in a very specific way. So the ideas that I'm promoting are dynamite because they explode our illusions, and they need to be exploded. Not for any destructive end, but a constructive end, we can't build unless we're aware of, and I'm watching the time and I can see it moving, the hand is moving on to 10 o'clock. Can I just say thank you so much? Is there anyone else who would like to make another point before we leave? And we'll keep it very short, like 60 seconds.